Hello, I'm Jak Tichenor. Welcome to Illinois Lawmakers' weekly coverage of the General Assembly here during the final month of May. I'm joined by Rich Miller of CapitalFacts.com. Good to have you on the show as
it's great
always.
To be here, Jak.
Rich, a lot of talk here in the last few days about budget making, but I'm not seeing much in the way of progress.
Well, they may be making a little progress here and there behind the scenes. I think they have started talking finally about Democratic ideas to shift revenue around. But yeah, publicly, the rule of thumb in this building is when they're making public comments that aren't being helpful, then they're not really working. When they're working, you don't hear any comments from the governor or the leaders or what have you.
What we did hear earlier in the week from the governor was that he thinks the Democrats are slow walking the budget process because they're not agreeing on a revenue estimate for the coming fiscal year to build that budget.
I think there's a good case that can be made that the governor is also slow walking the process. So, I think he's right, but I think the Democrats yesterday pointed out that the governor is doing some of the same things he's accusing the Democrats of doing.
Well, specifically, they're saying, the Senate Democrats in particular, are saying, well, where are some of the measures, where are the actual bills to realize some of the savings that are in your budget proposal? We don't see them here.
A big part of his budget relies on passing some legislation, substantive legislation, rather than just passing appropriations. And he's never even introduced language for that, which tends to undercut his stated belief that he really wants this done. Because that was February, and now we're here on March whatever, and May whatever. Whew. It's been a long year, Jak.
It has.
May whatever, and he hasn't so much as introduced this legislation yet.
And there's a big hang up right now on what the actual revenue estimate will be that you frame this budget around, and they're really only about $99 million apart.
Yeah, and it's even, plus there's more money that they may be able to find under various couch cushions, although there's probably not a lot there, but there's something that they can do. Plus, they are getting in some new revenue this fiscal year that was unexpected. It looks like to be only one-time revenue, but that takes a little bit of the burden off. I just think that passing a resolution which would say how much revenue you're going to get right now, that would lock in the spending levels, and I just don't see that as a good faith suggestion or demand at this moment.
The other thing that's kind of the other devil in this details is the fact that they're still looking for a supplemental appropriation of over $1 billion to pay off some of the costs that were run up, bills that were run up during the budget impasse.
The Constitution requires that all state payments have to be made through an official appropriation. That means the General Assembly has to pass a bill with a line identifying a sum of money, and then the governor has to sign that bill, and then the governor can't spend anything beyond what he's given. Now, he's given transfer authority, what have you. But what they did was, during the budget impasse, they convinced contractors for the Department of Corrections, human service providers, to keep operating, send us your bills, but we can't pay them, but we promise as soon as we get a budget, then you'll get paid.
And we still have to find that as we...
Right, so now they need an appropriation to pay off these bills that they ran up off the books. And it's $1.1 billion at least. That's at least what we know about.
And there are other costs, as we're going to find out. Rich Miller, thanks so much for your time on Illinois Lawmakers and your insights. We appreciate it. Up next, we'll have a conversation with a couple of the House budgeteers who are trying to draft this new budget. Here to talk about the budget-making process on Illinois Lawmakers, Democratic Assistant House Majority Leader Greg Harris of Chicago and House Republican Conference Chairman Tom Demmer of Dixon. Thanks for taking the time. I know it's a very busy week here at the Capitol. You're in discussions. You're two of what we call the budgeteers, two of the folks who sit down and actually crunch the numbers on what the state's priorities are and how much money we have to cover them. Where are we at this point in the process, Representative Harris?
We've been working all 4 caucuses along with the governor's office, going through some of the hypotheses that the governor built into his budget to see where we can find agreement and disagreement. It's been a slow go so far. We're hoping we can pick up the pace and reach some agreements this year.
And here we are, of course, we're in the second week of May. May 31st, of course, is the traditional adjournment date for the General Assembly. Are you confident that we'll get to the finish line as far as actually having a budget for fiscal year 2019?
So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think we have time. We have time to put together the kind of compromise that Representative Harris is talking about. We continue to work in good faith. I think a lot of times at the beginning of a process, it takes a little while to sort of build up some momentum and get things going. So I wouldn't take the last couple of weeks of slow going as necessarily a sign that it'll continue.
You say slow going. The Governor Rauner is saying the Democrats are slow walking the budget process, trying to drag this thing out, and they're not agreeing on what the actual numbers are as far as how much we're going to have to spend for next year.
Well, there's a problem with that the governor just doesn't like to acknowledge, and that is, besides dealing with the FY19 budget, he still has $1.1 billion in unauthorized overspending that he did back in FY16 and 17 that he wants us to take care of. That's $1 billion that we have to find money for. There's also a problem of $300 million in back due bills to nursing homes because the Department of Human Services failed to review the eligibility of the nursing home residents. And then there's another $260 million from when the governor tried to short employee wages, and the employees went to court, and a federal judge ruled against him. So now we have to pay our $268 million back to our own workers. And those are problems that he's created, and it's a big problem we have to work through.
Well, part of that comes out of the 2-year plus budget impasse that happened here for various reasons at the Capitol, and the $1.1 million, billion with a B, as you're talking about, for Department of Health and Human Services and the Corrections Department. He was trying to keep the lights on in those agencies, but the spending was not appropriated, correct?
Well, look, the legislature failed to do its job. The legislature is a place where appropriations bills start. It's the core function of the legislature to control the purse, the power of the purse. The legislature did not make appropriations. So we're left with a multi-year budget impasse. Of course, during that time, people don't expect us to close prisons and let inmates out. So we had to keep operations going. So I think, this is certainly an area where both the executive branch and the legislative branch share responsibility here. These are things that I don't think anybody suggests that the Department of Corrections shouldn't have been spending money during that time.
So you got a situation where you're looking at we're looking at a couple of revenue estimates. The Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, which is the bipartisan legislative unit that crunches all the numbers, has got one estimate. The Governor's Office of Management and Budget has another. They're very close to each other, within hundredths of a percentage point or tenths of a percentage point, like $99 million. Why can't you agree on how much you're going to have to spend? Why is this such a sticking point at this point in the negotiations?
Well, I think what we'd like to do is the real budget estimate, the real revenue estimate, is in the budget that passes. That is the statement of the different revenues, the different revenue sources, federal sources, income tax, sales tax that we have. That's where the real estimate has to be. We pass it as a portion of or alongside the budget itself.
And from the Republican standpoint, you're wanting a hard and fast dollar on estimate on that, or a bottom line on that. Why the insistence upon that when there are a lot of factors that may change? We just learned from COGFA this week that there's $500 million more coming into the state coffers in fiscal year 2018 than we expected.
Well, even with the revision of fiscal year 18 numbers, neither COGFA nor the Governor's Office of Management and Budget have changed their projections for fiscal year 2019. We as Republicans think it's important that we establish a revenue estimate first, because the core part of budget making is to say how much money comes in the door, and then we can decide about how we spend that. So we think it's important to understand what's coming in first. So I think we have agreement. As you pointed out, the items from COGFA and the Governor's Office of Management and Budget are very close. We think those are appropriate numbers to start with. If there are changes that happen later, we can make updates to those numbers later. But that's a reasonable and rational place to start.
The issue comes down to, again, you still have over $1 billion that's still on the books in the situation with Health and Human Services and Corrections. Where are you going to come up with that? Get it off the books for 2018 and
That's
go
what
on.
we keep asking the governor is you've got all these expenses, which, as Representative Demmer said, they certainly are legitimate expenses, but where is the money, where is the cash to pay them? I mean, the governor's idea is, well, you just throw it on the bill backlog, and there is more money the state owes. And that's a bad idea. Yesterday, we saw when the Civic Federation came out in opposition to the governor's budget, saying it's full of precarious assumptions. This is the kind of thing they're talking about, not having sufficient revenue to pay for the expenses you've run up.
And the Civic Federation, of course, is the budgetary watchdog group that works out of Chicago, and they've had a good set of numbers on the Illinois budget for many years now. And they're looking at things when he says precariously balanced. That comes from their report. The governor was banking on, if you will, saving hundreds of millions of dollars in employee insurance costs. That was one area. Another thing he wanted to do in his budget address was talk about a cost shift for pensions back down to the local school districts and the universities. These are things that haven't happened and may not ever happen.
Well, first, I'd say that on the supplemental that we've been discussing, that doesn't add to the bill backlog. Those bills are already reflected in the comptroller's report of the bill backlog, things that were expended in, up to 2 fiscal years ago. And so I am, for one, I'm pleased that the House Democrats have acknowledged that when we spend money, we need to have dollars there to pay for them. Over my course in the legislature, I've seen budget after budget that's been unbalanced. I've seen that there be quite a bit of a disregard or a disconnect between what our appropriations are and what money actually comes into the state. So I think that we stand ready to work together collaboratively to make sure that we have dollars that are lined up with every promise that we're making in the spending category.
In terms of those back bills, we at one point were upwards of $15 billion in arrears. The budget that was passed last July cut into that. I think I looked at the comptroller's office this week. It's still close to $7 billion. What's happening in this budget cycle or this next budget cycle to try to bring that back down and make sure that the providers for all the hospital, the health insurance, all that stuff is taken care of?
I think the first thing you start with is that we want to make sure we have a balanced budget for fiscal year 2019. That ensures that we're not going to make the situation worse. We don't want to add to the backlog of bills. So the first thing we have to do is make sure that's balanced. We can continue to work to authorize the comptroller to make those payments to pay down those bills. There are some bills that don't have appropriation authority with them. There are some things where we have a backlog at certain agencies of bills. We want to make sure that there's the authority for the comptroller to pay those down, and that we have a balanced full year budget that doesn't add to that backlog.
And House Democrats, I think, are going to really work this year on including measures to pay down that backlog further. It's not good enough to just let it sit there and continue to accrue interest. We should be looking at how much of those bills are costing us 9 to 12% per year interest that is just coming out of education and human services, and we need to find a way to whittle that down so that we are just not throwing money out the door to Wall Street and banks.
Well, we burned through over $1 billion because of this last thing, the budget impasse. That was over $1 billion in late fees and interest penalties.
And we need to stop doing that. That is money that's being taken out of direct services to seniors, to child care, to our public schools. We need to put a stop to that interest accruing.
Walk us through the next few weeks here. You're cautiously optimistic that you can get this thing over the finish line by May 31st. What's got to happen next? Is this going to be something that the budgeteers bounce back up to the 4 leaders and the governor, or can you do it without the governor?
Look, I think it's important that there be involvement from rank and file members, there be involvement from the budgeteer group and from the leaders. This is, I think, in order to have a successful effort, you need the input of of not just one or two people, but really the entire caucus. So I think there's certain decisions that we'll have to get guidance from the leaders on. There are certain decisions that I think we can arrive as a budgeteer group, and there are other things that we have to go back to our caucuses, go back to appropriations committees, and get their input and get their priorities on.
30 seconds to close, Representative Harris.
And I think what Tom said is pretty correct. Yesterday, we went through our caucus and we asked them not only to give us a list of items they want to prioritize to fund in this year's budget, we've also started the difficult decision of where we think our caucus wants to make cuts.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time. We always appreciate your expertise on Illinois lawmakers. Up next, we're going to hear what members of the Illinois Senate have to say about trying to get a budget here in the month of May. For an Illinois Senate perspective on the spring session issues, we're joined by Senate Republican Whip Karen McConnaughey of St. Charles and Chicago Democratic Senator Elgie Sims Jr. Welcome back to the program, and welcome back in the capacity as a new senator.
Thanks, Jack. I appreciate it. Good to be back.
Good to have you both here. Well, we were just talking with two of the House budgeteers about efforts to pass a budget before May 31st. What's the Senate's take on where we are here in the second week of May? Senator Sims?
I think we're making progress. Is it as quickly as I'd like? Probably not. But I think we're still working towards the May 31 deadline, which I think we'll make. I think we'll have a budget. We'll pass a budget by the end of the month, and what happens after that, we'll see.
Are you as confident?
No, but I'm glad to hear that Senator Sims is that confident. Actually, I think in the Senate, on both sides of the aisle, there's a lot of communication and work going on to cross off as many items as possible, right? To try to get to a solution. I think right now there's a little bit of a discussion going on about, do we need to set a revenue number? I happen to be one of those people that thinks, yeah, you need to set a revenue number because you need to know how much you have to work with before you start putting together your budget.
And I think that's part of the discussion we're having. As President Cullerton said after the leaders meeting recently, what we'd like to have is a discussion about the entire budget. We want to make sure that we're not locking ourselves into a number prematurely, but we want to make sure that we have a budget plan that addresses all of our issues. We have the governor's proposal before us, and we've been having some discussions about what's going to take place from there. We're thoroughly vetting those, and as Senator McConnaughey has mentioned, we are having some discussions both between the Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats, but also with our House colleagues as well. But I think that's why, again, I'm an eternal optimist, Jack, and I believe we'll get there.
We like that as a newcomer from the House.
It was overall fresh and dewy-eyed.
Yes, it does.
I was the same way in the House. I was the same way in the House.
Well, part of the discussion, of course, in the last couple of days has been centering on, well, if you're talking about setting a revenue target, which target are you going to use? You're going to use the governor's management and budget target, or are you going to use the Commission on Governmental Forecasting and Accountability? You're a member of that group, COGFA for short. They're only about, $99 million apart, so what's the big deal?
Well, and I think we recently had the Department of Revenue come in and talk to the group and as well as COGFA to talk about some of the issues that we face. And we're seeing that you'll see that 2018 revenues are doing a little bit better, but what would that mean for 2019 revenues? So it really becomes a matter of having that discussion in totality, how we're going to have a discussion about the entire budget.
And the COGFA was saying this week that it looks like you might actually have $500 million more in terms of revenue during 2018.
Yes.
But you can't really use that in your bottom line because you don't know that it'll be back there in 2019. Is that
right.
the assumption?
Well, because federal sources doing better because of some of the Medicaid spending and other federal spending we've been doing. So our reimbursement rates are higher. We're seeing some additional revenues receipts coming in through the personal income tax from additional sources there. So it really, again, but that addresses impacts how we go forward in the 2019's budget, though.
Yeah, we really have a better scenario to work with than we did a year ago. What we were facing, and I was involved in last year's budget negotiations, a much more complex situation. That's why I think your optimism is probably not far off, because it's not that difficult for us to get where we need to go.
And Senator Sims, you're one of the so-called budgeteers this time around, and you've been in that capacity before. Take us inside one of those meetings as much as you can say publicly about that. There's been a very profound difference on these revenue estimates. The Senate President, John Cullerton, saying, well, you may not want to be locked into this because more money may come, or I don't know how you shake out the couch cushions to find all this, but he doesn't want to necessarily be locked into it. The governor and the Republicans do want something to say, this is how much we're going to spend.
Well, but because there are also other policy decisions you could make that might impact the overall budget number. Those are decisions that the leaders would have to make as a group. And then outline and ideas coming from rank and file. So we'd have a revenue number that might change. So we have the estimates now, but there may be some other policy changes that could come about that might change that bottom line.
As long as that new revenue isn't new taxes.
Well, I would say that that would be the place that would absolutely not happen this time. There's not been one discussion coming from the Senate Democrats or the House Democrats or anybody in that room that talks about new taxes. But there are other options out there. Some folks have talked gaming. Some folks have talked legalization of marijuana. I mean, there are other policy decisions that could be made. Whether that happens or not, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, but we're in the last three weeks, really, last 3 to 4 weeks of this session. So legalizing recreational marijuana, although it could bring in several $100 million to the state's coffers, that's probably not going to happen in an election year. And gaming is always out there, but no one never seems to pull the trigger on it.
Jack, we've seen some amazing things happen in the last couple weeks of a session. So we've got a long way to go. We haven't even hit May 15 yet.
So there is this thing called putting the bill on extended deadline. That's a little trick you can play to actually let something find new life in the last few days of session.
Right.
Yeah.
There is one of the other aspects of the ongoing budget negotiations is the amount of money that comes from state revenue back to local governments down at the city, county, and village level. And there's a group of mayors who are very concerned about last year. Was it last year or this year? They took a 10% cut. Is that what it was? And that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you have a relatively small budget or even a big budget, that can be a big hit on your local resources. So we're hearing a lot from the mayors.
Well, and justifiably so. I mean, they've come to count on that money. That's always been a handshake agreement. But once you start receiving revenue and then spending it, you develop obligations. And local units of government, municipalities have the same sorts of problems that we have in state government. A lot of them have short-funded pension problems that they've got to take care of. I mean, there's a lot of issues. These are the people who provide direct services to the people of Illinois. Your electricity, your water, garbage pickup, police. They play an important role. So they're justified in the concern. But here's the bottom line. It's painful. It is a painful process. Everybody has to be part of the solution. So no one should make any guarantee that it's going to remain intact.
No,
right? You agree?
Oh, absolutely. We're hearing. I talk to the mayors across my district all the time, and they have the same concerns because they don't want to have to lay off firefighters or police officers, and it's a real concern. They don't want it impacting direct frontline services.
And as we get down to the end of the session, of course, we're still looking for a number of things to happen. But there was a deadline earlier in this month in terms of adding constitutional referenda to the ballot in November. Redistricting didn't make it. Term limits didn't make it. The governor wanted that. How much play do you think? These issues, of course, are very important to people. They poll very well. My guess is those are not going to go away. We're going to hear about those again.
I think you're going to continue to hear about both of those issues because you're right. It is important to people. I think the redistricting issue has actually in the past received a lot of bipartisan support and continues to do so. That's just never been able to get past the Supreme Court to make it to the ballot. So I think somewhere along the line, you're saying this happened in other states. This is not unique to Illinois. This question about how we draw maps. So I don't think it's an issue that's going away. The term limits issue, that's a very controversial proposal in this building. I'd like to point out that while as important as that might be, you're going to have a 40% turnover likely of the General Assembly in this election cycle. I'm not going to speak for the other side of the aisle, but I think a limit on leadership positions is probably, and we've talked about that, passing that resolution.
Senate's passed that as part of its rules.
Right.
So at this point, this is an ongoing issue, not going to go away by any stretch. You mentioned turnover. I just saw over, like you said, 37 incumbents or 21% of the House and Senate are not coming back next year. What does that do to the dynamic up here? Although you're new to the Senate, you've been in the House and you've been on Senate staff for a number of years. What's that do to the dynamic of this place?
Well, it impacts the institutional knowledge that you have, but I think there's something to be said about having new blood, and having people with new ideas come in. But as Senator McConnaughey mentioned, there's a huge amount of turnover. But it's good to make sure that we're working on getting fresh ideas in, and that's what you see with the people who are serving currently. I always hasten to tell people when you talk about term limits that there's some thought that people are inherently doing things that are not in the best interest of the public, and that's just not the case. You find public servants who are serving right now, they're doing tremendous work. They're working extremely hard under some very difficult circumstances.
There's a lot of expertise here that comes to play every day here in the Illinois Senate and the Illinois House, and a lot of institutional knowledge with both of you. We appreciate your time on Illinois Lawmakers as always.
Thanks,
Senator
Jack.
McConnaughey, Senator Sims, thanks for joining us. That's it for this week's edition of Illinois Lawmakers. We'll be back next week with continuing coverage of the spring session of the Illinois General Assembly.